Hey everyone, this is Alan Stanton. I'm the director of the Turner Center at Martin Methodist College, and we're continuing our video series where we look at how we lead through this really uncertain time with the COVID-19 pandemic. Today we have Glenn Stallsmith with us to talk about worship and leading worship in this time. Glenn is a THD student at Duke Divinity School where he's focusing on worship and liturgy, and he's also a rural pastor, and we graduated from Duke around the same time. I think, was it the same year, Glenn?
No, I think you were a couple years ahead of me.
Oh, okay. Well, Glenn and I got to hang out a lot at Duke, and then we've been good conversation partners and good friends since then. And Glenn knows more about worship than anyone else I know, so I wanted to bring him on to talk about the theology of worship during this time, but also the practices and how he's leading his own church and congregation through this. So, Glenn, I want to start. Constance Cherry talks about this fourfold model of worship, and you've talked a lot about how that's a really great tool for us to think creatively about our own worship services. Could you talk a little bit about that model of worship and then how you're using that to lead worship now?
Sure. I like Constance Cherry's the way she expresses it, especially in her book, The Worship Architect. I think she uses the example of a building following the architect model and setting up four walls. So you have the initial wall, which is gathering or entrance. You have a second wall, which is proclamation of the word. And then the third wall is what follows after the word. And that's really essential to her whole theology of worship in that it's a rhythm of revelation and response. So we hear from God, and then we have the privilege of responding to God. That whole aspect of listening and responding is really the core of worship. So the whole third fold or the third move of a worship service is meant to be a response. And you see that, say, in the United Methodist Book of Worship, which is also structured in four folds. Right. It's labeled a little bit differently, but the idea is in a word and table service that after the word, you go to the table or you have some other kind of appropriate response. So you hear the scripture read, you hear it proclaimed in the form of a sermon, and then you respond. So you maybe confess, maybe you intercede for the church in the world. You pass the peace and reconcile with one another. You take an offering. Those are all responses to God's grace. Then you go to the table. Then the fourth and final move or wall or room or whatever analogy you want to use for this fourfold order is the sending. And the idea is that we worship so that we might be sent out into the world, so that we might be drawn back together and gathered together at another time. So that's the main thing. Constance, of course, didn't come up with that idea, but the way she packages it is very accessible for folks out there looking to do revitalization or renewal or just to do a deeper dive into their worship practices. The Worship Architect's a good place to start.
So during this time of social distancing, it seems like it's easier to do that first part where you hear the story and you can gather in whatever sort of setting. But that second whole half of like going out but also responding, that's a little bit harder. How do you do that when you're distant?
You're exactly right. All of our typical responses are done in community. They're done in a room of other people where we engage together. So anything you do online is just going to feel less than that, unfortunately. But there are some ways to do it better. I was a part of a prayer meeting a couple of weeks ago, which is basically based on the Book of Common Prayer, the way that the Anglican and Episcopal churches have been doing it for hundreds of years. And I wondered when I signed in via Zoom to that meeting, how on earth we were going to do that. How, for example, would we say the creed together? How would we pray the Lord's Prayer? How would we say the Psalms together, which is a normal practice? And basically everyone was on mute except two people, and there was one person who led and one who responded. But what was interesting is for everybody who had their cameras on, you could see that they were participating. You could see that they were saying the same things. Even though the bandwidth and the technology wouldn't have allowed for 30 people together say it, they were still able. So that was an interesting way to do it. Now, if you're doing just a one-way thing, like a Facebook Live service where you can't see what other people are doing, you can still put a rhythm in your service that allows them to do that. And this is where I think some of our rural churches really can shine, because we tend to hold on to those, what we would call more traditional aspects of a service, say singing the doxology,
Right.
or saying the Lord's Prayer. Those are great things to put in an online service where maybe you're the only one speaking it, but and you're giving a space for everyone listening or participating online to speak it too. So to me, that's about the best you can do and can hope for in the environment where we're trying to stream stuff.
Yeah. Well, and I want to touch on something you mentioned there, which is that social aspect and community aspect. Worship is theological, but in our rural congregations, it's also sort of a social gathering spot. It's where you come and you see everybody and you get the week's gossip and, where you catch up with people. How do you maintain that aspect of it? Because I think that's so essential to the life, and like that worship and social life is integral to the idea and essence of a rural church. So how do you maintain both of those during this period? Or can you?
I was going to say, am I allowed to say I don't know? Which actually, let me just say, sort of as a side comment of sorts, I was on a Zoom meeting with 9 other pastors in my county, mm-hmm. and all small rural churches, and several, if not most, of everybody on that call was saying, this pandemic, this shutdown is really making me feel even more inadequate as a pastor. That tendency is always there, right? I mean, we all look at some other church that has more resources, that has more people, that's more dynamic in this way or that way, and we're always comparing ourselves. That's just the trap of being in ministry. But adding that to this social media presence, where now you can just sit down and scroll and see what everyone else is doing.
Oh, yeah.
Has been really difficult. And, some of my colleagues are saying, there's really no point in me streaming something, because there are not enough people in my congregation who have access to this technology or are comfortable using it. So I'm trying to figure out what to do. I'm trying to figure out how to be a pastor. And, there's not a great answer to that, I don't think. I said, well, I initially thought, like 3 weeks ago when we stopped worshiping together, I said, I'll call everybody. I have 2 small congregations.
Yeah.
I'll call everybody every week. Well, I made one cycle through that and realized not everybody wants to hear from me every week. Like, it's just maybe every 3 weeks. Yeah, because the pastor, that's not what the pastor does, Now, there's some people that would love me to call them every day. And so I just think that it's that figuring it out. I'll just say one other thing, and this may be good or bad. But one of my friends said that what she was going to do, one of my pastor friends said that she was going to go to people's front porches, not unannounced. I think she was going to call ahead or whatever, and just stand on the porch and talk through the door, or even talk on the phone. So not make any contact, not allow anything to, not anything to pass between them, except just being in the same place.
Right.
And, I'm not going to do that. That's just, I don't think that would fit for me, but I think she discerned that would be meaningful for several people in her congregation. And so I think that's just what it comes down to. I've been using the word discern a lot in these 3 weeks. And it's just what works in this situation, what works in this context, what's the piety of the people that I'm called to serve, what technology do they have access to. And some people I've talked to are mailing sermons.
Oh, wow.
Which I wouldn't do, but there might be a great case for that. And maybe emailing to most people and and postal mailing to those who wouldn't get it. But, I think there's a few books in the Bible that were written that way.
Right.
So,
well, it's
yeah.
been really interesting, to watch all the churches. I think sometimes small churches feel a pressure to do whatever the large church down the road is doing. And so I've seen some people like start live streaming, but I've also seen a lot of smaller churches say like, man, that's not who we are. And so we're setting up conference calls where are really just a very short devotion and prayer meetings, or they've really shifted to just providing pastoral care, where they're going to have maybe some like email out a sermon, like you said, and then the rest of the week they're setting up smaller accountability sessions, like so people are checking in on each other. We did a webinar you were on it a couple weeks ago, and I one person told a story where they took their devotional materials for the week and like dropped them on the front porch of their parishioners and knocked on the door and ran away. So it's really just kind of cool to see the creativity that comes out of these rural churches. And to, like, you don't have to do what this other large church is doing down the road.
That's right. I think that's the main thing that I would want to assure pastors is just don't fall into the trap of comparison, because every congregation is different. And that's the cliche, but it's just something we, especially in the rural church, need to be reminded of constantly. We're not even the same as the other church right down the road that looks like it could be the same church. It's not. And what we're working on, especially pastors who are appointed to multi-point charges, like you're going to have to pastor those 2 churches or 3 churches or 4 in different ways.
Yeah.
Like I have one church where I really needed to write a letter like right away to remind people to give, and how, send out the address for the church treasurer or the finance secretary. This is where you can send the money, send your checks. Other church did not a need at all. Like they were on top of it. They were, so, and I think to me, that's been the most exhausting thing these past 3 weeks or so, is just every day it's having to figure something new out.
Right.
It's not necessarily taking more hours. It's just like, what am I not doing, or what could I be doing? It's that second guessing, and some wonderful things can happen out of that, but it's also very tiring.
Right. So when you're designing, a worship experience for your 2 small churches, or you're writing devotionals during this time, or you're trying to find ways for them to gather and respond and go out, what are some things that you're trying to keep in mind that other pastors should be keeping in mind, both theologically but also just practically?
Let me say 2 things. One's a general principle, and then I'll give a specific example. In terms of a general principle, is kind of like that applies to Sunday morning worship. It's basically just say something. Like sometimes a Sunday morning sermon just is not coming together, and you stand up and you just have to say something. Like that's what you're called to do, and it might not be prepared. I would say in this moment, like whatever media you can use, whether it's Facebook, a live stream, or just a post, or whether it's email, or whether it's letters or phone calls, or the show up on the porch visit and wave, like do something. And it doesn't have to be great. For years, I've sent out like a Wednesday morning prayer update that gets broadcast out. I use MailChimp to do it. I think it hits 28 mailboxes, and from what MailChimp tells me, maybe 40% of people read it.
Which is actually,
I sent one out last Wednesday. It's not a bad rate, right? But it's church members, so anyway. Last Wednesday morning, I sent out what I just thought was like the most embarrassing in the sense that there just wasn't anything really great about it. It was just a reflection on a couple verses. Basically said, God's with us, and kind of left it at that. And I never get responses to those. No one ever replies back. No one ever says anything to me about it, which is fine. I don't expect it. But on that day, I got a text from someone who never texts me
Oh, wow.
And I got someone actually replied to the email, and both said in their own words, "This is what I needed to hear now." So say something. I think that's the general principle, that I would find a way to get a message out there just so people know that you're there. Now, one of the ways that that's played out for us in our congregation is that I'm one of those churches that would not have on my own decided to say live stream or do a Facebook Live service. Most people aren't on Facebook. Those who are, not every one of them would connect with it or want to sit down. But a pastor of a larger church, which is right down the road, invited me to be a part of what she's doing with her congregation. And she's very generous. She said, let's make it a cooperation between the three churches, your two and mine. And, we use her musicians and her technology people, and I just come in basically, and I'm a conversation partner. And so we talk through a passage of scripture instead of preaching. We sing some songs. And one of the biggest feedbacks we've gotten about that, one of the biggest areas of feedback is, it is really great to see two pastors cooperating and getting along like that. Because we've been in a covenant group together for years, so there's a rapport between us. We're good friends, and that comes through. And so I thought, if nothing else, like maybe one of the biggest witnesses that will happen through all this will be this one example of cooperation. So yeah, that's one thing that's worked for us. It's not something that I would have ever planned, but rolling with the opportunity that was open to me has seemed to benefit. And not only does her church participate with a large number, but there's a significant group of my parishioners who I can see every week who've come on to the services and chatted with other people, or do whatever you do on Facebook comments.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you have this foundation of these 4 rooms, and then you're able to kind of improvise around that, and that you're cutting yourself a lot of slack. So when something goes well, you're able to just kind of pivot and say, okay, well, we'll try something new.
Yep. What we've done in terms of those 4 rooms or 4 walls or 4 moves is that the gathering and the sending are basically music, where the musician is playing something without the expectation that people are singing along, but it'd be what we might consider an anthem or an intro. And that's partly due to because that we're using, because we assume that not everyone is there at the downbeat of, say, the service is going to start at 10:15 or whatever. So we kind of do this, maybe you could call it a slow build, but the gathering is music, so that by a couple minutes after the start time, we assume those people will be there, and that those who stay through the whole thing or are consuming it like they're watching other things might tend to drift out a little earlier. And so what they're going to miss at the end, the sending, is music. So that the middle part, it's necessarily more important, but the middle part is the proclamation and response. So that's how those 4 walls have worked out for us and what we're trying to do online.
Awesome. So I want to pivot just a second to talk about the sacraments during this time of social distancing. So I don't want to put you on the spot, but to kind of close out, I did want to ask you about your view of virtual communion, not necessarily as a judgment. I know different pastors will do different things, but what are some things that if pastors are going to do it, they should remember? What are some things that they should, try to stay away from? What should pastors be thinking about when they're entering into a conversation about virtual communion?
That's good. That's another one of those areas where I've used discernment a lot over the last few weeks. And I'll just say, and again, this is not me trying to condemn anything, but I will not be doing it. And a large part of that is because I serve congregations where communion's not an essential part of their piety. It's important to them. They go forward when we do it. Nobody sits back and doesn't participate. And there aren't anybody that I know of that chooses not to come on communion Sundays or anything like that. But they grew up taking communion once a quarter. And we do it once a month. And as far as they're concerned, that's plenty. And so we've missed, 3 weeks now of Sunday services, and nobody's clamoring for it. So I think, we can wait it out. As far as my congregations are concerned, this is probably, hopefully, no more than a 3-month, away from worship kind of thing. That's not going to put anybody out. So I'm not going to go through the effort to distribute elements or do whatever you need to do. But that's me. And again, but that comes from a place of discerning what works in my context. So that's the point that I would give to answers like, what's going to work for you? What's the piety of the people? Are they going to respond to this option if you give it to them? There's all kinds of arguments, and you haven't invited me to enter into those. But I guess for a theological point, and you want to have a theological basis for doing what you're doing. For me, where I'm landing on it is that we, as Americans, have made an idol out of technological solutions to problems. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that Facebook Live services are bad or that we shouldn't do them, but we always want to jump to an answer. And part of that is what makes America great. But we also have not practiced just sitting in stuff that we lament, mm-hmm. and not really soaking in the words from the Psalms that cry out, for instance, "Why have you forsaken me? Lord, where are you?" And I just think that maybe we need to take a time where we say, you know what? We're not going to celebrate Easter like we normally do. Not by choice, but by this thing that's been put upon us. And in some cases, we're not going to celebrate communion. And it's going to be a season where we don't. It's going to be more like fasting than feasting. And then someday we'll start it up again. And maybe we need to just realize that that's an okay thing to do. So again, can God be mediated through through what happens on a computer? Probably. I don't think God's limited. It has to be in the same room. A long time ago, we Christians decided that God could be in heaven and on earth at the same time. So can God be present in front of your computer screen? Yeah, of course. To me, that's the least interesting part of this discussion. But if that's what needs to be real to you, then I think you could go ahead, But to me, it's how are we living into this current moment? And in some way, for me anyway, I just think that abstaining seems to fit what's happening. Now, if this is going to be a year or 2 years, I would probably advocate for finding a way around that.
Right.
But I think for a few months, I'm okay with living without it.
So you brought up Easter, and we're recording this on the Wednesday of Holy Week. It seems like this year is sort of a year to sit in Holy Saturday, and kind of let that ruminate a little bit more. But I am curious, how are you preparing for Easter with your own congregations?
So, and I don't know how widespread this is in different annual conferences, but in our annual conference, North Carolina, our bishop is actually live streaming 2 services on Easter morning. Not requiring, obviously, for anybody to tune into those, but offering it as a resource. And so we're gonna do like a 10-minute intro, and then encourage our folks to stay tuned to that. That's just one way in the middle of all this for us Methodists to be a little bit more connectional. Like we can watch the same service. So that's what's going to work for us. We're doing a Thursday night service. We're going to do about 20-minute meditation with some prayers and a reflection. That's about it.
It sounds like you don't really you're not feeling a lot of pressure to like make it this big grandiose thing, but really kind of live into what's happening right now and the realities of the current situation.
Yeah, I'm not feeling that kind of pressure.
That's right. I've heard some churches are actually just saying like, we're going to really celebrate Easter when we come back together as a congregation. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Not strong ones. I think it's okay to miss Easter. It's okay, like, to come back together whenever we do, whether it's Pentecost or the weeks after Pentecost, and say, you know what, there's a lot we missed this year. But on the other hand, every Sunday is a celebration of the resurrection.
Right.
And so whatever Sunday brings us back together, absolutely celebrate that. We're not limited to one Sunday a year to call that out and proclaim it. So
kind of the joy of being a Christian, right?
Exactly.
That's why we come together on Sundays.
That's right.
Awesome, Glenn. Well, this has been really great. Thank you so much for joining us today. And if you need any other resources around leadership during this time, we invite you to check out www.cultivaterural.com. You can also check out the other 2 videos in this series, and we'll be posting more throughout the next couple of weeks. Glenn, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Alan.